It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to today's online event, Istanbul's Russian Moment, 1919 to 1923. For this last event in our fall semester program, I'm joined by my Columbia colleague, Professor Valentina Izmirlieva of the Department of Slavic Languages, who will introduce and moderate a conversation with our distinguished guests, Vladimir Alexandrov of Yale University and András Riedlmayer of Harvard University. Today's event grew out of an exhibition project on the same topic. Professor Valentina Izmirlieva and I are currently preparing for the Pera Museum in Istanbul for 2020 or 2023. The schedule is still a little bit up in the air due to the COVID crisis. It is a collaborative project with several institutional partners, such as Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library and Columbia's Bakhmetiev Archive, the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul, the Kirac Foundation's Istanbul Research Institute, the Pera Museum, and others. Given their deep knowledge of the topic, Vladimir Alexandrov and András Riedlmayer have recently joined the team of scholars working on this exhibition project. And what they are sharing with us today are insights into two important facets of the Russian refugee crisis in the years between 1919 and 1923, and the cultural impact the arrival of especially white Russians in Istanbul had during these years. My own interest in this period and topic was sparked over a decade ago when I mounted an exhibition on Thomas Whittemore, a Bostonian literary historian and archaeologist who turned into a fundraiser and relief worker following his experience in the First World War. Founded several American philanthropic organizations and helped with Russian refugees in Istanbul. And eventually he founded the Byzantine Institute of America, which received permission from Kemal Atatürk and his Council of Ministers to uncover the Byzantine mosaics of Hagia Sophia and restore them and the celebrated frescoes and mosaics of the Karyajami later in Istanbul. Before I turn the podium over to my colleague Valentina Izmirlieva, who will introduce our guests, I would like to briefly introduce her. Professor Izmirlieva is a scholar of Balkan and Russian religious cultures with a strong background in critical theory and intellectual history. Two areas of specialization represent the scope of her teaching interests: the religious culture of the Orthodox Slavs, with an emphasis on the medieval and early modern periods, and literary modernism and postmodernism with a focus on Vladimir Nabokov. Much of her research addresses cultural transfers among Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the context of multi-religious empires. And her interests in Istanbul emerged as part of a project she founded here at Columbia entitled the Black Sea Networks Initiative. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Department of Slavic Languages for co-sponsoring today's event. I would like to thank both Professor Irina Raifman, the current chair of the Slavic department, for working with us to advertise and host this lecture. I would also like to thank the staff of the Sakib Savanji Center, especially Sharon Kim, for her work behind the scenes to make this online event possible. And thanks are also due to you, our audience today, for joining us. We will enable the chat function later during our session, so you can communicate your questions directly with our panelists. And once we move to an open floor discussion, I will ask those of you who would like to participate in an in-person discussion to raise your blue Zoom hand to indicate that you would like to ask our panelists a question directly. Dear Valentina, I will turn the podium over to you and welcome to our panelists, Vladimir and András.
Thank you, Holger, for the kind introduction. Dear guests and friends to the Savanji Center, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our panel today dedicated to the Russian moment in Istanbul history that unfolded exactly 100 years ago. In the bloody aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the subsequent civil war, close to 200,000 subjects of the former Russian Empire found refuge on the Bosphorus by December 1920. Among them were over 300 artists and leading figures of the Russian culture from all spheres of creative life. The refugees had no intention to stay. The Ottoman capital for them was only a temporary refuge, a transit station on the long road to their global dispersion. And most of them left the city by 1923. Still, however brief, this Russian moment proved deeply transformative for both guests and hosts. And our long-term project is focused on exploring its diverse effects on the Russian exiles in Istanbul and on the city itself. As Holger mentioned, this project grew out of the Global Black Sea Networks initiative, which I have been leading since 2016. And with the support of the Sabancı Center and the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul, Holger and I have embarked on an exciting adventure that aims to create a big exhibition at the Para Museum exactly on this Russian Istanbul moment. And our esteemed guests for today's panel have kindly jumped in on board with us and shared our adventure. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome them among us today. Our first speaker is Vladimir Alexandrov, the Bessinger Professor Emeritus of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Yale University, who has also taught at Harvard before moving to Yale. He's published widely on Russian literature and culture from the 18th to the 20th century, with special attention to Tolstoy, Bialik, Nabokov, and literary theory. A graduate seminar on Russian emigre culture between the wars led to his discovery of Frederick Bruce Thomas, the son of former Mississippi slaves who became a multimillionaire impresario in Tsarist Moscow, and the Sultan of Jazz during this Russian moment in Istanbul. His discovery resulted in the award-winning biography, The Black Russian, published in 2013, which I'm happy to report is currently under option for a TV series. Right now, he's working on a book about Borisovnikov, which will be published next year. Professor Alexandrov will revisit his work on Thomas today in the context of the broader contribution of the Russian emigres to Istanbul's music scene. So please welcome Vladimir Alexandrov.
Thank you very much, Valentina. It's a pleasure for me to be taking part in this. Thank you for inviting me. So as Valentina indicated, my topic is the case of the Black Russian under the general rubric of the Russian moment in Istanbul, 1919 through 1923. And as Valentina said, this is the title of a book that I published in which I use this designation, the Black Russian, to identify my subject, the protagonist of the biography, this remarkable man whose real name was Frederick Bruce Thomas. He was the son of former slaves, born in 1872 in the Deep South in Mississippi. And his story is relevant to our general topic because despite this origin, he wound up being a real player in the Russian moment in Istanbul a long time later. But first, let me very briefly, in a couple of minutes, describe how he got from Mississippi to Constantinople, which is a very unlikely path. His parents were remarkable people. They were emancipated at the end of the American Civil War in 1865 and immediately managed to break the mold for Black Americans in the South by becoming very successful farmers at a time when most Black Americans, in fact, many white Southerners, were completely impoverished. They had a very large farm of 600 acres. They were very active in the local Black community, all things that I think influenced their son when he was born on their farm in 1872. But of course, when Reconstruction ended in the American South, prominent Black people began to pay the price for their success, and the family's livelihood was destroyed by a rich white planter who tried to steal their farm. Didn't quite succeed, but didn't quite fail either because the family took him to court. But the family had to move to Memphis, which is where Frederick Bruce Thomas got the rudiments of an education following what he had been able to learn in a small rural school in the South. Then another tragedy hit the family. The father was killed in a murder by a disgruntled tenant, and that had the effect of breaking the family up and allowing my protagonist, Frederick Bruce Thomas, to start traveling. And he really never stopped for the rest of his life. In 1890, at the age of 18, he went north, first to Chicago and then to Brooklyn, which was very unusual at the time because the Great Migration, when American Black people went to the north to find improvements in their lives, did not begin in earnest until a lot later, after the end of the First World War. Frederick Thomas found professions that he could follow in the north, which were as a waiter and a valet. After working in Chicago, as I mentioned, he went to Brooklyn. And then, in a way that was also without precedent, he decided to go to Europe, apparently to study music, a career that he never actually pursued, but he landed in London in 1894, again, decades before Black Americans began to expatriate themselves to Western Europe, and especially Paris, in a search for personal and artistic freedom. And he traveled widely throughout Europe for the next 6 years, working everywhere as a waiter or a valet, very portable professions, picking up languages. He learned French fluently, learned quite a bit of German, and was on his way to Italy to start studying and learning Italian when he paused in Monte Carlo and caught the eye of a rich Russian tourist. Who exactly, we don't know. It depended on Thomas's moods. He would sometimes describe this person as, of course, a Grand Duke. At other times, it was somebody of lesser stature. But this fortuitous meeting resulted in Thomas's going to Moscow around 1900. After working as a valet there for a while, he started to revert to his profession of being a waiter. And over the course of the next 18 years, up through the summer of 1918, Thomas's life curve constantly climbed. After working as a waiter, he became a maître d'hôtel at a well-known entertainment garden. After that, he became the assistant of the famous owner of the Yar restaurant, which was celebrated not only throughout Russia, but also in Europe. By 1911, he had earned enough money to, together with a couple of Russian partners, take over a failed entertainment garden called Aquarium and to make a great success of it. The remnants of the garden still exist in central Moscow. The following year, he used his profits, which were now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in contemporary money per year, to take over a failed theater in a central location in Moscow, a place that he called Maxim, and a name that we'll have reason to return to. So while his personal situation was constantly improving, and he also married and had children, of course, as you know, the historical political curve of the Russian Empire was gradually sinking and then plummeting. The revolution of 1905, the devastation of the First World War, the February Revolution in October. Thomas survived the February Revolution. His properties remained intact. He sponsored vaudeville, light operettas, farces, light forms of entertainment like that, combined with generous pourings of various kinds of alcoholic beverages for which he was famous. He introduced American bars to Moscow culture, apparently, and refined Franco-Russian cuisine. Anyway, he survived the February tumult in Russia, but when the Bolsheviks took over in October, he discovered that he was on the wrong side of history. The Bolsheviks didn't care that he had been in an oppressed minority in the United States. It mattered to them that he had become a rich man in Russia. And you can get some sense of how well he had done in Russia, in that just on the eve of the February Revolution, he bought an entire block of apartment buildings near what is now the Hermitage Garden in Moscow. He had to escape from the Bolsheviks and did to property that he had in Odessa in the south, which in 1918 was still in the hands of the Germans and therefore a sanctuary from the Bolsheviks. That sanctuary did not last. After the armistice, the French came in and took over the north shore of the Black Sea, the former area of the Russian Empire. There was hope among the many white Russians, including Thomas, who took refuge there, that it would be possible for this French enclave on the Black Sea to become the kind of incubator for a crusade by the white Russian armies against the Bolsheviks. It didn't work out. By April 1919, the Bolsheviks were advancing, and Thomas began plans to escape yet again. The only place he could get from Odessa at that time was across the Black Sea to Constantinople. And in this, he was one of the early individuals who lived through what became a whole series of evacuations of South Russia from 1919 through 1920, and resulted in the end, as Valentina mentioned, in some 200,000 Russians making their way to the sanctuary of Constantinople, which was a sanctuary because right after armistice in 1918, the Allies, the victorious Allies, took over the city, the French, the British, the Italians, and the Americans, who didn't occupy any territory because they hadn't been at war with the Ottoman Empire, but who sent a large and powerful fleet to the Bosporus. In any event, the move from Odessa to Constantinople was for Thomas, as it would be for scores of thousands of others who came from Russia and followed him, very harrowing. The conditions were miserable, barely tolerable. And once he landed in Constantinople, he faced the problem that countless Russians would soon after him as well. What do I do now? What do I do to make a living? Where do I live? Most who arrived in Constantinople were destitute. Thomas subsequently remembered that he had perhaps a total of some $25, as he put it. And this was out of a fortune that was counted in the millions before he had to flee the Bolsheviks in Russia. So he had to do the same thing that Russian emigres would start doing later. He would have to rely on whatever skills he had and his wits to try to find a way to make a living. And so what he did was to revert to what he had done successfully in Moscow, focusing on popular entertainment. In the same way that the destitute Russians would do anything they could to produce a viable profession for themselves, he did the best he could with what little he had. He managed to secure loans from Armenian and Greek merchants at usurious rates of 100% over 6 months, rented an empty lot on the fringe of Constantinople in the area known as Shishli, and opened an open-air garden for the summer of 1919. This wound up being an epical event in the history of Constantinople and of the Russian movement into the city, because what he did in the garden was to foster Western styles of light entertainment. Music. He introduced jazz for the first time, apparently, in the history of Constantinople at the end of August 1919. Dancing between men and women, which was not something that was at all widespread in conservative Ottoman culture. The drinking of alcohol, which existed, of course, before this time in Turkey, but it became increasingly popular with the influence of Western and Russian modes of entertainment. And popular entertainment by such performers as, for example, Alexandrov, very famous in Russia and then later in the emigration, and Isa Kremer, another singer who went on to great success in Europe after the stay in Constantinople. Things were very hard for Thomas. He barely made ends meet, but he managed to survive. Now, one other thing that he experienced that also foreshadowed or echoed what many of the Russians who would come in 1920 would experience, is the issue of legal papers. Thomas applied to the American Consulate General in Constantinople to be recognized as an American citizen, and they denied him. They denied him simply for purely racist reasons. He was a black man who had arrived trailing stories of great wealth and success in Russia. He had a white wife and a handful of mixed-race children, as they thought of them, with him. They didn't like the idea that he was now trying to claim American citizenship, and he was denied. This was all right for the time being for him because the city was under the occupation of the Allies, and he managed to deal with the problems that stemmed from his not having a valid passport adequately for a number of years. But as András will no doubt mention, the Russians who arrived later were also without papers, and that became a real problem for them when it became a matter of trying to get out of the city and go somewhere else. Thomas kept struggling against creditors who claimed that he didn't pay them on time, antagonizing the American Consulate General in Constantinople increasingly until he became a real thorn in their side. But he managed, nevertheless, to succeed as an entrepreneur in the realm of Western-style nightclubs. In 1921, he opened what became a signature establishment in Constantinople during his life, and then after he died, as I will describe in a few minutes, for decades later in the life of Turkish Istanbul. And this is a nightclub called Maxim. He had one place like that in Moscow. There were Maxims in every European city anyway, so it wasn't unique to him. He found a space underneath the so-called Majestic Theater, a major cinema in Taksim Square in central Istanbul, a basement space that opened out onto a wide terrace with views of the Bosporus, and established a first-class Western-styled nightclub with good food, an excellent bar, jazz bands that became a regular fixture in his establishment. And the place quickly became the toast of Istanbul. By November of 1920, the massive white Russian emigration or flood of refugees that Valentina mentioned had arrived, flooding the city with very many destitute Russians. Thomas's life intersected with that as well in terms of his being one of the early employers of young Russian women who became waitresses. Many of the white Russians who arrived in Constantinople, the women in particular, had never worked to make a living before, and they took on any occupation that they could find. They became very popular as waitresses. In fact, the French term dame serveuse, or a lady server, came to designate specifically younger, attractive Russian women who worked as waitresses and became a great draw for the restaurants that started to employ them in imitation of Western models in Europe. Given the racist pressures under which Thomas lived from the Americans in Constantinople, it was inevitable that people would start spreading rumors that he took advantage of his young Russian women. And it's interesting that I was able to find in an archive a report written by an American reporter for the highest ranking American in Constantinople at the time, Admiral Mark Bristol, who was the American High Commissioner, saying that these are complete lies, that Thomas was in fact very careful in how he treated his lady employees, and in fact, they considered him, and this reflects the racist terminology of the time, to be the whitest employer in Constantinople, by which was meant that he was the one who was most considerate of his employees. There are lots of reminiscences about Thomas as a generous man, as a kind man. Destitute Russians, when they were looking for employment, would come to him looking for jobs. his staff was full, but I found a reminiscence in the old Russian emigre newspaper that used to be published in New York, the Novaya Ruskaya Slovo, the New Russian Word, that nobody who knocked on the door of his Maxim, or the earlier incarnations of his nightclubs, was ever denied a meal. So he was remembered fondly by the Russian diaspora. As we'll hear, the Russians did everything they could to get out of the city, and by 1923, most of them had succeeded. There were only a few thousand left. Thomas stayed. He couldn't leave. He had no papers. The Nansen passport that had been developed specifically in 1921 and then used later as well to help stateless Russians move around the world did not apply to him because he was ostensibly an American citizen, even though the Americans would not recognize him as such. Just as a little aside, I might mention that when he applied for a second time to the American Consulate General for an American passport, his case was referred to the State Department in Washington, and word came back that we have no record of the fact that he was ever an American citizen. When I went and looked at the State Department papers when I was researching my book, I found 8 different passport applications that he had dutifully filed in various European places, in addition to other documents, indicating that the papers were always there. And either the clerks were so inept that they could not find them, or more likely, they found them and didn't want to acknowledge that he had a perfect claim on American citizenship. At any rate, when the Russians left and the Turkish Republic was announced in 1923, Thomas's innovations in popular entertainment began to resonate in harmony with the secularization of Turkish society that Mustafa Kemal, subsequently Atatürk, began to advance, such as the mixing of genders in social settings, the kind of dancing that Thomas encouraged in his nightclubs was all something that actually Atatürk himself would encourage in various ways. We know that Atatürk was a tippler, and this is also something that Thomas's efforts in promoting popular entertainment helped plant in Turkish popular culture. And then, of course, jazz, which took root and which survives to this day as an important aspect of Turkish popular culture. Thomas succeeded for a while in keeping his enterprise afloat, even after the Republic was announced and even after various xenophobic policies were instituted in reaction against the capitulations that had allowed foreigners various privileges in the past. But of course, other people got the idea that what he was doing is saleable. And to make a long and somewhat tragic story short, competitors began to open establishments that outshined Thomas's, as a result of which he tried to compete. He went into debt and got himself into trouble that he had to deal with in the Turkish legal system because he was a stateless former American in Turkey. There was no one else he could turn to for assistance, as a result of which he lost Maxim to creditors in 1927. He tried to escape to Ankara, the new capital, to reestablish himself there. That didn't work. He was arrested, put into prison, and died in the prison in Constantinople in Istanbul in the summer of 1928. By this point, he was destitute. He had been taken in as a charity case by French Catholic nuns in a hospital in a building that is now near Taksim Square, and was buried as a charity case in the French Catholic cemetery in Fariköy in Istanbul, after having been given service in the Saint-Esprit Cathedral that also still is in the city. So his life was really quite remarkable, both in its own terms, simply as one man's attempt to buck the forces of history repeatedly, and then also in the way in which it paradoxically intersected with the fate of the White Russians in Istanbul. And it's pleasing to see that various people in Istanbul now are interested in his legacy. So one of the hopes that I have that correlates with what Valentina and Holger are talking about doing is to perhaps even commemorate Thomas when and if the exhibit at the Para Museum takes place, and frankly also to put up a plaque in the cemetery where he was buried to commemorate the fact that he had been there, because when he died, there was no money for any kind of commemoration. I would be happy, very happy to answer any questions that you may have later on, but now I'm looking forward to hearing what András has to say.
Thank you, Professor Alexandrov, for this remarkable tale about the life of a remarkable man who in many ways embodied the entrepreneurial spirit of cultural invention in Istanbul by the white Russians, even though he was himself a Black Russian. Let's turn to our second speaker today, András Riedlmayer, who has directed the documentation center of the Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at Harvard's Fine Arts Library since 1985. A native of Hungary, he studied at the University of Chicago and at Princeton University, where he specialized in Ottoman history and Near Eastern studies. As a Fulbright scholar in the 1970s, he spent several years living in Istanbul and has been back to what he calls his favorite city many times since. He has published widely in academic and professional journals and has served as the president of the Turkish Studies Association and as a member of the board of the Islamic Manuscript Association. Mr. Riedlmayer's research interests include the study of Southeastern Europe's centuries-old Islamic cultural heritage and of its systematic destruction in the recent Balkan Wars. He has served as an expert witness on cultural destruction in several international trials, including the trial of former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic at the UN War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague. Mr. Riedlmayer will present for us today the remarkable Charles Davis Papers collection at Harvard and its significance for exploring the Russian Istanbul moment. Let us give a virtual round of welcome applause to András Riedlmayer.
Thank you, Valentina. So let me share my screen. My presentation today includes a small sample of images from the archive of Charles Claflin Davis, a young Harvard-trained lawyer who in 1920-23 managed American Red Cross relief operations for some of the tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers fleeing the civil war in Russia who had found refuge in Constantinople, today's Istanbul. The Charles Claflin Davis Papers, including hundreds of original photographs that document the lives of these refugees in Istanbul, are now held by the Harvard Law School Library, which has digitized many of them. This photograph shows Major Davis and his team shortly after they arrived in the Ottoman capital in the summer of 1920. A few months after their arrival, the stream of refugees from the Russian Empire turned into an absolute torrent as the Crimean Peninsula, one of the last remaining strongholds of the white forces, fell to the advance of the Bolshevik Red Army. More than 140,000 soldiers and civilians were hurriedly evacuated from the peninsula aboard 136 ships of the White Navy and of the Entente powers. After a rough passage across the Black Sea, their first port of refuge was Istanbul, from where they eventually scattered around the world. The Turkish journalist Yakup Kadri was a witness to this human drama. Writing in the November 19, 1920 issue of the popular Istanbul daily Ikdam, he wrote, "A friend who saw one of these ships up close as it was passing down the straits told me, 'I will never forget the dreadful overcrowding I saw on that ship. I don't know how bad it was inside the ship, but seen from the outside, there were people holding on to each other, hanging from the ropes and cables like bunches of grapes, from the ship masts all the way to the anchor chains, layers of people on top of one another. Even in the small lifeboats hanging on either side of the ship, there were at least 50 or 60 people jammed into each boat. For 4 days now, crammed on board of those ships, dangling from ropes and masts, these people have been waiting, hungry and thirsty. What is awaiting them? That they do not know themselves. General Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel, who oversaw the evacuation of soldiers and civilians from the Crimea in November 1920, put the total number of white Russian refugees in Istanbul at 167,000, including more than 30,000 who had arrived earlier in evacuations from Odessa and Novorossiysk. Some 69,000 of the newly arrived refugees were sent onwards to camps in Gallipoli and other locations outside of Istanbul. These refugees included not only ethnic Russians, but also many other peoples of the Russian Empire: Ukrainians, Jews, Armenians, Georgians, Tatars, and Kalmucks. Among the evacuees from the Crimea were 22,000 Kuban Cossacks sent on by the French authorities to the Greek island of Lemnos. The Cossacks had been disarmed, but remained in their own military units under their own officers' command. Like most of the destitute refugees, they faced an uncertain future and miserable conditions. Once the Russian refugees were allowed to land in Istanbul, the most immediate problem was where to house them. The city, with a pre-war population of close to 1 million, was already overcrowded with refugees from the 1912-13 Balkan Wars, from the First World War, and from the ongoing armed conflicts in Anatolia. It was also under Allied military occupation and had to accommodate thousands of Allied soldiers and officers. This photo from the Davis Archive shows the Istanbul waterfront. At far right is the Dolmabahce Palace, the residence of the Ottoman sultans. At first, many of the refugees were put up in the imperial stables behind the Dolmabahce Palace, as seen in these haunting C.C. Davis photographs. This is the interior. And here's another group of Russian refugees. Those more fortunate among the refugees found lodgings in the city arranged by the Russian legation in Constantinople, which was still under the control of the whites, and which set up a temporary hospital inside the embassy compound. This is the gates of the legation. But there were many others who were forced to shift for themselves. Some of them camped out in the open beneath the crumbling Byzantine city walls. Other than issues of finding food and shelter, the most vexing problem faced by the refugees was finding gainful employment. The ongoing military conflicts had cut off the city from its natural hinterland in Anatolia, and commerce was at a virtual standstill. And many of the refugees were young men who had few marketable skills other than soldiering. This photo shows an Istanbul flea market with young Russian refugees trying to find buyers for their meager possessions. A refugee economy of sorts sprang up in Constantinople with makeshift Russian taverns and shops and many other ways of improvising a living. Here you see a group of Russian refugees living in tumble-down houses near the city's land walls, where they took in washing and planted vegetable gardens. The American Red Cross aid workers and the self-help initiatives of the Russian Towns Union organized craft workshops in the camps that housed many of the refugees. This photo and the next one show Russian refugee cobblers at work making shoes. This portrait shows a group of Russian refugee women in a refugee camp in Tuzla on the Asian shore of Istanbul, making ladies' hats. Both women and children were employed in sewing and ironing clothes. But the Russian Towns Union also set up schools for the children in the camps and orphanages. This photo from the Davis papers is simply captioned, "Russian Princess at Work." For some of the refugees, such as officers and men of the White Army, other opportunities beckoned. The French, in need of more troops to control their restive colonial possessions, enticed refugee soldiers to sign up for the French Foreign Legion. Those who survived military service in the perilous tropics could qualify for French citizenship after 3 years. Some of the refugee soldiers, among them many of the Kuban Cossack troops still encamped on Lemnos in 1923, ended up in the Balkans, where the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, the future Yugoslavia, gave asylum to more than 40,000 white Russian troops and civilians, including General Wrangel himself and prominent Russian Orthodox clergymen. The Kingdom of Bulgaria took in 10,000, Greece accepted 2,000. Those who could do so found new homes in Western Europe, in North America, and some as far away as Brazil. Charles Claflin Davis left his station in Istanbul in 1923, returning to America with mementos like this one, as Istanbul's Russian moment was drawing to a close. The armed conflicts in the Russian Empire and in Anatolia had come to an end. Tired of war, the publics in Western Europe and in the United States had no more stomach for interventions abroad. Turkish nationalist forces had won the war in Anatolia, and the British, French, and other occupation troops in Istanbul had no choice but to withdraw. The last Ottoman Sultan boarded the British warship and left with them, as did many of the city's non-Muslim residents who had imagined a different future. This photo shows a detachment of British troops lined up on the dockside in Istanbul. On October 6, 1923, the victorious Turkish nationalist forces, led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later called Ataturk, marched into Istanbul to the cheers of the city's Muslim majority inhabitants. The new Turkish Republic abolished the capitulations, the legal privileges extended to foreigners under the Ancien Regime. In 1927, the Turkish government stopped issuing residence permits to foreign refugees. Some 10 to 15,000 of the remaining Russian refugees chose to stay on and to take Turkish citizenship. Some of them eventually emigrated, some returned to the Soviet Union, others found their places in Turkish society, married local people, and assimilated. So what sort of imprint did the Russian moment, transitory as it was, leave on Istanbul and on Turkish society? Professor Alexandrov has already mentioned the impact on the local entertainment and music scene. Another novelty popularized by the Russians was the summer rush to the seaside. Turks already had a well-developed bathing culture, but until this point it had been largely confined indoors to hammams, the magnificent Turkish baths. In the 1920s photo at left, we see Russian refugees in bathing attire, enjoying the sunshine and bathing in the Sea of Marmara on the coast of Istanbul. At right is the cover of the Turkish women's magazine Sevimli Ay, from the summer of 1926, featuring the latest in ladies' fashions in bathing suits. Another innovation popularized by the Russians was the consumption of tea, made in a samovar and drunk from little tea glasses. Until the end of World War I, the preeminent social beverage in Istanbul was Turkish coffee. Coffee, grown in the Ottoman province of Yemen, was a domestic product in good supply and available. After the war, this was no longer the case. The Russians' fondness for tea drinking and the new republic's decision to promote the growing of tea along Turkey's mountainous and rainy eastern Black Sea coast made Turkish tea the new social beverage of choice. While refugees from the Russian Empire contributed much of the labor for Istanbul's 1920s nightclubs and restaurants as cooks, busboys, waiters, dancers, and musicians, only a few of them had the capital to operate such businesses. Out of 1,619 restaurants in Istanbul in 1922, only 44 were owned by Russians. But Istanbul's nightlife and the habit of fine dining as a form of fashionable entertainment was formed during the Russian moment of the 1920s. This is the cover of a Turkish satirical magazine called Güler Yüz, featuring a bemused Turk ogling a Russian waitress and wild people dancing in the back. Istanbul's most famous and longest lived Russian restaurant, the Regence, was established in 1932 by Russian refugees who had stayed on, said to be former ballerinas. The photo at left was taken in the 1930s when the Regence was the place to be seen. I ate chicken Kievsky at the Regence in the 1970s when it was no longer so glamorous. In 2011, the restaurant closed, but it has since been revived as a luxury nostalgia venue, a memento of a romanticized past. You can see the entrance at right. Another lasting contribution of Russian emigres to the culture of the city was in the realm of music and the arts. The Belarusian dancer Lydia Krasa Arzumanova had studied at the Imperial Ballet School in St. Petersburg before the revolution. She arrived in Istanbul as a penniless refugee in 1921 and was among those who stayed on. She married a Turk and opened a ballet studio in Istanbul. Arzumanova and her dancers gave their first public performance on the stage of the Casa d'Italia in Istanbul in 1931 and went on to perform in the new republic's capital, Ankara. The dancers and choreographers that she trained became the leading lights of Turkey's new state ballet and opera. Over the years that followed, most of Istanbul's Russian emigres either left or assimilated. By the final decades of the 20th century, the city's Russian community was on the verge of disappearance. But the gradual opening of the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s brought a new Russian moment to Istanbul. I recall seeing some of the first Soviet tourists arriving on the ferry from Odessa, clutching cut crystal bowls and other goods to trade, since they were given no hard currency allowance. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the small stream of ex-Soviet tourists, most of them Ukrainians and Russians, but also others, turned into a seasonal flood. Some of these visitors chose to stay. Those so inclined can still visit Istanbul's 3 rooftop Russian Orthodox churches, built in the 1870s to serve Orthodox pilgrims on their way to visit Mount Athos. Though now endangered by the city's rampant development, the churches remain, ready to welcome worshippers and visitors. Istanbul's latest Russian moment has yet to pass. Thank you. Spasiba. Teşekkür ederim.
For this rich panorama of Russian life in Istanbul. Both presentations were absolutely fantastic, as we expected, and so I'm sure that they will generate a vivid discussion. At this point, I will invite all participants who would like to ask questions to activate the blue hand on their screens, and I only ask to limit each question to under 1 minute so that we can leave more time for discussion and for more questions. So at this point, I'm just opening the floor for questions. And Ayşe Kajulu has requested to ask a question. Ayşe?
Okay, here I am. I also wanted to start my video because I think it's more polite to show your face when you're asking a question. This is actually really, mesmerizing. I mean, both of them, the pictures, the photographs were wonderful. I was actually a fellow at Columbia at the Sabancı Center visiting scholar last year. And, both Holger and Valentina, they know about this. I came across the story of Iraida Berry and, just read through the archives. And as I was reading about this, it is not my field. I'm not a historian, it was just something that I was, interested in personally. As I was reading through the stories, of course, I remember reading other sources, some New York Times reports, some reporters writing in the New York Times about the white Russian move into the city, and descriptions of those ships, like thousands of people in them, as it was also described here. One thing that I remember, and I always thought Iraida must have been on one of the ships on April 1919, maybe. But then the big flux actually did take place in November 1920, really. Basically, this is really interesting to see all these separate stories. But what I'm curious about is in these reports, by people like Eugene Baumgartner, for instance, the author of Undaunted Exiles, I think, maybe this other person, Anne Mitchell, who reported to Admiral Bristol, what I see in their accounts is that they were all in love with the city, Istanbul, but they did not think very highly of the locals. Locals, Turks, Armenians, Greeks, they were basically saying the food in the Greek and the Armenian restaurants were not good, and when the Russians came. So I could see these, and I just was aware of them as I was reading, that there was this gaze, the gaze maybe of the, occupants, because the city was under occupation. So I wonder what Thomas was thinking about the locals, because he hits me as a man who would have been in good relations with the locals. So this is my curiosity, a question to Vladimir, if I can ask. I'm sorry, it took a long time, but thanks.
I think your hunch is right. There is evidence that Thomas was very popular with the local Turks after 1923 for another 3.5 years, when the Russians were gone and when the various Western military forces were gone as well. He became the toast for a particular well-heeled slice of Turkish society. There are various anecdotes. I report one in my book that I'm actually indebted to András for, because he not only found it in a Turkish source, but was very kind in translating the Turkish source into English for me. And so that's the kind of charitable gesture that Thomas was quite capable of making toward an underling in his operation, a young woman and so on, who was in love with a young man, and he tried to help them out. He's remembered fondly by memoirists of that time after the Allies and the Russians left.
There's another question to Vladimir from Bulut Chakmak.
Hi, sorry, I won't be able to start video like Aisha, but I was wondering, you've mentioned that Thomas had to pass while arrested in a prison in Istanbul, I assume, if I recall correctly.
Yes,
I'm
that's
wondering what the excuse was for that. Was the Young Republic, trying to play closer to the Bolshevik regime and so not allowing the white Russian immigrants into Ankara, or did they suspect that he might be a spy, having this very diverse background? Do we know what they used at least as an excuse, if not the actual reason?
Yes, no, it's known. Thomas incurred debts when he was trying to compete with competitors in the entertainment business in 1927 and 1928. He could not pay his debts, and he was required to surrender his property as partial compensation. He tried to escape from pursuit by the law. I don't know all of the details, but that's the general sense of things, by going to Ankara. But he was arrested for non-payment of debts and put into debtor's prison. So it was basically an economic crime that he was accused of having committed. And since the conditions were primitive and he had had pneumonia several times before in his life, that's what he contracted again and died. So it really wasn't anything like the Soviet, purely economic class warfare motivation for killing people. It was his failure to compete as a businessman.
Thank you. It was less climactic than I expected, but I guess it's a more normal death. Yes.
Alice West has a question for András.
Hey, well, first, András, thank you for very interesting presentation. I asked this question in the chat, but I'm not sure that the chat is monitored, so I'm going to verbalize it. I'm curious, what were the funding organizations? You particularly mentioned the Red Cross, the government of Turkey, and there was another organization, the name of which I didn't get. And the reason I'm asking, I was looking through the photos before this presentation, and there were quite a few that showed fairly well-furnished places, like with beds and just basically nice places. And it's very encouraging to see how there are international organizations and governments that actually help thousands of people who find themselves in this situation. It's a very, at least from what I can see, somebody was funding it, and it could be very encouraging to see this kind of actions. So if you could comment on that, who were those who funded this? Russian immigrants.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Well, first of all, for anybody interested, if you go to the Harvard Library website, the majority of the photographs in the Davis collection have been digitized, and you can browse through them at will. As far as relief organizations, there are several published reports by Davis himself and by others that speak about refugee relief in Istanbul during this period. It was a complicated business because although nominally there was an Ottoman government, and while the Allies, as the occupiers, had some control of the city, nobody actually had a firm handle of how many refugees were in the city at any one moment. Many of the refugees were undocumented, in fact, most were. And this was a population constantly on the move. As far as relief operations were concerned, to the best I could determine from the reading I did, is there were many organizations. The American Red Cross was only essentially a second-rate player. A lot of the relief was organized by the French and paid for by the British. But all the local organizations, as well as local organizations within the refugee community, had their own relief efforts. So there was, the biggest one was the Russian League of Towns, or Zemskvos, that organized education, orphanages, and so forth. The various religious organizations, Jewish, Armenian, Orthodox, all had relief efforts going. The Ottoman government took mostly care of Muslim refugees, both from from the Balkan War and the First World War, but also some of the Muslim refugees from Russia. So it was a very complex thing. You know, once most of the refugees had left, the ones who stayed tended to be the ones who had found some niche to make a living in. And so by the late 20s and early 30s, there was no more need for relief work. In the wake of World War I, of course, this was not the only refugee emergency in the region. There were thousands upon thousands of Armenian refugees from the war and the genocide who were encamped in Syria and Lebanon. Western Europe was afloat with homeless people. You might recall that President Hoover made a name for himself organizing relief in the wake of World War I. So this was a vast human emergency spanning an entire continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just an encouraging thing to see that there are so many people in need, and there's still others who find resources and strength to organize and help them. That's, you know, kind of nice.
Timur Saitev has a question.
Hello, I'm trying to unmute my video, but I can't apparently. So I have a question to András Riedlmayer. The records of the Davis collection says that the author of the photographs and the captions to the photographs made by W. Zeliz, and I was not able to identify who this person is. And do you know anything about this person? Who was it? Was he Russian, or was he representative of Red Cross? Because some captions, for example, talks about from the first person point of view, like these our Kalmyk brothers, or other captions says as they arrived last winter. So it could be assumed that it's from the point of view of the Red Cross. And also, like, if you see the captions saying Russian princess at work, it's looks a little bit paternalistic, or somehow, I'm not sure if it's some Russians, the Russians themselves would say, could create this picture, this caption. So, and the second question is very quickly, you said that French offered to Russian soldiers to serve in the French Legion for the citizenship, French citizenship after 3 years. Do you know any cases that they really granted this citizenship to Russians, or it was just a promise? Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll take your questions in turn. I don't know much about the photographer you mentioned. As you can see, some of the photographs show a real skill in photography. Those photos of the stables are absolutely haunting. But as you could also tell, the photos in Davis's collection came from multiple sources. You can see the formats and the kind of camera employed varied. Also, groups of photographs in several albums were given to him as keepsakes when he left Istanbul in 1923. He had made a name for himself among the refugees, not only by what he did in Constantinople, but in 1922, he had actually gone to the League of Nations to address the League of Nations on the needs of the Russian refugees. As far as the paternalistic aspects, you could see from some of the photos I showed, they would show groups of refugees and always representative of the aid agency portrayed with them. So in some ways, I think these photos were meant, among other things, for fundraising. And finally, what was your last question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
It was about the French citizenship after the 3 years.
Okay, the French citizenship after 3 years in the Foreign Legion was not special for the Russians. It was a standard offer for anyone who joined the Foreign Legion. The Foreign Legion, which still exists, was founded in the 19th century, and as its name implied, it was meant for non-French citizens who would agree to serve France at peril of their lives. And if they survived after 3 years and were still eager to do so, could receive French citizenship. If they chose not to take French citizenship, they could have a permanent residence permit to live in France. So that is still on offer as far as I know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, András. There is a question to Professor Alexandrov from Eugenia Colbert. Should I read it, or she would like to ask it herself? So this is a minor question, she says, but I was wondering, how come Mr. Thomas didn't qualify as a stateless Russian? Hadn't he become a Russian subject before immigrating? I'm also curious what happened to his wife and children, as they obviously couldn't support him in the end of his life. Thank you. What a colorful and resilient personality.
Yes, well, this shows Thomas is trying to play a complex game. He did become a citizen of the Russian Empire in 1915. It's a remarkable fact that he petitioned and was accepted. He did this to show his support for the country where he had been living and working successfully for a long time during the Great War. But when he got to Odessa and needed to get on board a boat before the Bolsheviks took over the city, he wouldn't be able to do it if he admitted to being Russian. He also, incidentally, had given up his American citizenship papers when he became a citizen of the Russian Empire in 1915. So, to get on board a ship, and there were very few ships available, the few that were available were mostly made available to representatives of the all-powerful Allies. He went to the American consulate in Odessa and presented himself as an American. In other words, concealing the fact that he had expatriated himself earlier. And on the basis of his skin color and his accent and his manner, the consul general assumed, yes, he was, of course, an American, and he didn't know anything about the fact that Thomas had taken Russian imperial citizenship. In fact, the fact that all of this happened is something that I was able to put together from archival evidence. There is no evidence in the State Department that they ever found out about this. There's no evidence in Russian archives about the fact that, anyway, let me not digress. But that's why he couldn't, once he got to Constantinople, attempt to follow the path of Russians who, as stateless individuals, applied for the Nansen passport. Thomas met Fritjof Nansen in Maxim when Nansen visited the city. But by then, Thomas had established himself as an American who was trying to get American papers and couldn't suddenly undo that and present himself as a Russian. The fate of his wife and children was tragic. They couldn't work. His last wife was German, left Constantinople in the hopes of getting help for her sons in Constantinople from Germany, got stuck in Central Europe for a number of years. One of the sons succeeded in getting to Prague. Whitmore, among others, who was mentioned today, helped young Russian men and women get educations in Western Europe. And Mikhail, Thomas's oldest son, who was born in Moscow, managed to get to Prague and get a higher education there. The younger boys led a hand-to-mouth existence for the better part of their lives in Constantinople, and then with Istanbul, with great difficulty made it to the United States, after which I stopped trying to trace their paths. And so I don't know how they ended except for having died relatively young.
Thank you. There's a question from Victor Ostapchuk.
Yes, hello. I have a double question for András. One very easy and quick is about this Charles Claflin Davis papers. When did this become available? How much work has been done on it? And what you showed, you could do a nice book, picture book, coffee table book. I mean, what's the potential of it for research? Is it just photographs or other papers? My second question is about a more anecdotal thing. You mentioned the second Russian moment, or I'd rather call it the Soviet moment. In 89 and 91, I was in Turkey, in Istanbul then, and I witnessed this invasion of lots of Ukrainians because of geographical proximity, lots of Russians too. And you mentioned coming on a boat. The way I witnessed this, and I actually partook because I started going to Ukraine often then, it was a very different travail. It involved, you think you could take a bus or something to go straight across. There was no direct land link going along the Black Sea. You had to go all the way to Sofia by train. Change trains there, sometimes have to wait a day to get on the right train and go from Sofia to Istanbul. It took 2 or 3 days to do. And it's quite entertaining because when the Soviets were coming into Istanbul, they were wondering where do we get off? And the Turks kept using the word durak. Yeah, there was so many duraks. The word durak in Russian and Ukrainian means stupid idiot. So the trader, the migrants were saying, why are the Turks always using this word durak and so forth? But in any event, when you mentioned, I mean, I'm being someone that works in the Black Sea, I always wanted to go across the Black Sea in a boat. And when I was trying to do this, it was only 2 boats that would go across. This is already in Ukrainian times to Odessa. One was known as the disco boat, or the nightclub boat. It was supposed they were the woman of a repute wind, and the other one was just a normal boat. I never got on it. You mentioned that you saw people coming on a boat. Really, was that really going on, or was that just illustrating your story?
Okay, well, first of all, as far as I know, the Odessa-Istanbul ferry no longer runs. But in the 1970s, it was the main way for people from the Soviet Union to come to Istanbul. Overland was simply not an option. Mm-hmm. And there were daily boats or maybe multiple times a week that came into Istanbul from Odessa. And it was indeed sort of a heart-rending scene to watch these poor, lost-looking Soviets standing on the big sign that said Durak, which means bus stop or dolmuş stop in Turkish.
Train stop. Mm-hmm.
And they're clutching their trade goods because they were not given any hard currency allowance. And by that time, of course, all the young boys who work in the covered bazaar had enough phrases of Russian to strike up trades with them. But that was the 70s.
Where did they go, in Eminönü or into?
There were cheap hotels in around Aksaray.
Right, that's how it was. Where did the boats land, actually?
They landed on the Galata side. halfway between Karaköy and Beşiktaş.
And the first
You know,
question?
the big boat terminal.
The first question, historiography. The papers as a
the Davis papers. There is if you go on the Harvard Library catalog,
I see.
there is an elaborate finding aid for what's in the Davis papers. I think the photographs, which is the only part I've actively explored, and right now the only option, because they're the only part that has been digitized, are only part of the larger collection. And most of the collection is devoted to his relief work. He had a very interesting career. He started out as a straight law student and developed an interest in international law. And so after he got his law degree, he went to graduate school in international relations. And then the First World War broke out. He volunteered to become an ambulance driver, first for the French and later for the Americans. Briefly after the war, he practiced law, and then he got caught up in relief work in Istanbul, and he never went back to the law again. After 1923, when he returned to the States, he went out to California and became president of a small university. And his papers ended up then at Harvard and ultimately at the law school.
Thank you very much.
I don't see any more hands for questions. Yes, please. You have to unmute yourself.
Muted myself. Now can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. I don't really have a question, but I was born in Istanbul. My mother and her parents came from Odessa by boat. I guess around the 1920, maybe 23, because my mother was already 5 years old. Here is a photo of all the ancestors, and I still remember stories of what you said. And Atatürk actually gave my grandfather, my mother's father, was a Cossack hetman. They were Ukrainians, but they spoke Russian at home. And Atatürk apparently gave some land to my grandfather so that they could cultivate. In Istanbul, there was nothing after the war. So he grew wheat and so on. And that lot is under the Turkish airport, Atatürk, or Turkish airport right now. Government confiscated it. And I grew up with all these stories. I remember the church. And my good friend here in San Francisco read Vladimir's book. And a few years ago, she has highly recommended it. I never got to it, but I certainly will. And András, from your name, it sounds like you have Hungarian background. And my mother met a Hungarian in Istanbul, also an immigrant, and married there. Now, the question, yes. And anyway, out of 6 siblings, and my grandfather held, his contribution to the Turkish society was that he held the beaches in Florya. And yes, Güneş Plajı. And that was very close to Atatürk's summer home, the one that goes out onto the street. And my mother, in those days, there was not high security. We're talking about probably 1930s, 40s, early 40s. They, teenagers, all the siblings, the Ukrainians, they all were on the beach, and my mother met Atatürk several times. So my question is, I tried to do some research to find my the Topçis, my mother's side. It's a rather, to me, it's a rather unusual Ukrainian name, and his first name was Klein, and he was buried. He and his wife, my grandmother, are buried in at the cemetery in Bakırköy. Actually, it's a Greek cemetery, but there is a little Russian area over there. I just Googled their name. I could not find anybody Klein. And apparently there was correspondence with my grandfather when they came to Istanbul, but then the Soviets took over and his siblings in Russia said, and Ukraine, near Poltava, said, do not write to us because they were afraid. So there is no connection, and I could not find anything. If I want to do some research into the clips, how would I do it? Into the history of the, my family.
Do you have any papers, any documents, any archive left?
No, I don't. Unfortunately, all I know is that, I could probably get the death certificates from the cemetery, but that's about it. I don't even know what year they were born. All I know is that he sold horses to the White Russians, and that's why they were after him. He left Zolotonosh, that was near Poltava, and he left his wife and his 5 kids behind, and came by boat to Istanbul. And the boys, the siblings were pretty old. They were all born over there, except for the very last one. But I could not find.
Thank you. Is somebody willing to take this up? It's a very specific question, which is perhaps for another time. We have a line of questions here. But thank you for sharing.
And I will read the books, and I'm very, very moved about this show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Jesse Cassidy Howell has a question for András. You mentioned relocation in Gallipoli and Cossacks on Lemnos Islands. Did any such refugee population remain in Turkey or the Aegean after 1923?
Well, as I mentioned, 10 to 15,000 Russian refugees took Turkish citizenship in the late 1920s. And while some of them stayed on, others eventually left either for the West or some returned to the Soviet Union. The early returns to the Soviet Union, this was already in the early 20s, it turned out to be a disaster. The first group of refugees sent back to Odessa was shot at the moment they stepped off the ship. But then later on, group returns became possible. And during the Cold War, especially, the Turkish government was applying pressure to get Russians out of Turkey. It was an era of great paranoia, and it didn't matter that you yourself or your parents had fought the Bolsheviks. The Turks wanted you out of there.
Thank you. There is a message from someone identified as Marina, which I imagine is Marina Siergi. For Vladimir Alexandrov, as far as I know, if I'm not mistaken, Thomas was buried at Refugee Protestant Cemetery. Question: how did you find out about that? And did you have a chance to work with the archives of this cemetery? You may read this. I live in Istanbul and wrote a book about Russian immigrants, and now I'm working with cemetery archives.
I think that my first lead was in a death announcement in a Istanbul paper. There was one in French that was published regularly, and I remember finding it in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And that indicated to me, if I'm not mistaken about the sources, that he had died in the hands of the French Catholic nuns. There's a building near Taksim that I think is now a French cultural center that used to be a hospital. And I went to the French Catholic cemetery in Fariköy. And in record books that they have there in a lodge near the entrance, I found a register of deaths, and I knew what day he had died from a newspaper account. And I found mention of his having been buried there. So it wasn't in the Protestant cemetery, but in the Catholic one. And then I went to the Saint-Esprit French Catholic Cathedral, or the Catholic Cathedral in Istanbul. And if I'm not mistaken, I found a reference, yes, I do remember, I found a reference to the fact that Thomas had been given a funeral service before being buried. at the Catholic Church Cathedral, even though he was not in fact a practicing Catholic as far as I know. But that's not a very extensive archive, it's just a couple of ledgers.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I would like also to take the opportunity with such a large audience to ask you if you have any family information, any archives, anything that might be useful for preparing our exhibition, or would like to get involved, please do get in touch with the Sabancı Center, to Holger and to me personally, and we will be happy to work with you. This has been a fantastic panel, and if I don't see any more hands, we'll take the opportunity to thank again our wonderful speakers and our hosts, the Sabancı Center, Holger, Sharon, and everybody who got involved in the organization of it. I hope this is just, so I look forward to other new panels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I just wanted to give a word of thanks to our panelists, to Valentina, András, Vladimir. A wonderful panel. There will be more to come. We hope that we will have a couple more events in the spring and in the coming fall to follow up on this exciting story of Russian refugees and the Russian moment in Istanbul. As you saw from some of the visual material that András shared, there is much to discover, both in terms of the impact on fashion and in terms of the impact on music and the entertainment life, as Vladimir showed. And I think this will be an exciting story visually for an exhibition, but also the many different stories to uncover. The private stories, the stories that have come to light as part of the research that we have heard about today. So thank you, everybody, and I hope to welcome you again at one of our next events. Thank you.